Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the themes of privacy, measurement, and marketing effectiveness. I'm Andrew Hood. I'm CEO here at Lynchpin, and these themes are three themes that I think are quite topical in the industry, and also three themes that are affecting our clients a lot. So the purpose of this briefing is really to give you an overview of some of the key developments in these areas, some of the important trends, and also just how these trends might affect some of your plans in the short term, medium term, and long term. So there's three parts to this webinar. The first part's really thinking about what's happening in the backdrop of regulation. So what's happening in the law, how are regulators responding to that, and how's the industry responding to that? And also, equally, if not more importantly, how are consumers responding? We're then going to consider how that's impacting digital measurement. So how's that impacting what we can and can't measure? And looking at that through the lens of an internet that's increasingly divided between, for example, what you can do in an Apple world versus a Google world, and how that's affecting some shifts between first and third-party data and how those are being used. And then finally, we're going to look at how that impacts how we measure marketing and how we judge the effectiveness of marketing, and thinking about what are the roles of things like attribution, marketing mix modeling, and testing, and how do we find the right balanced approach between these different things. And we'll finish off with some questions. So please feel free to submit questions as we're going through the content today. Hope to have around 15 minutes at the end to cover off any questions. You should be able to find in Zoom, there's a Q&A button at the bottom you'll find, or if you're in full screen mode towards the top. So please feel free, you can submit questions anonymously if you wish, and we'll pick those off as we get to the end. So a lot of change in the industry has been driven by changes in regulation and how regulators are behaving. So this section is really focusing a bit on what is the current landscape from a regulatory perspective, and most importantly, what's changing. So we should start with the law. There's probably three important laws to think about if we're operating globally. So in the UK and the EU, probably the oldest and the most general of the data protection regulations is the GDPR. And this is really important for digital measurement, basically because it understands the idea that if we are profiling the behavior of users based on things that we can identify them indirectly with, so things like visitor IDs and cookies or IP addresses, then that becomes personal data and it falls under GDPR as a result. GDPR, we have a few options for being legal when we're processing personal data, and that includes consent, but also includes things like legitimate interest, where we establish there's a good balance in how that impacts the consumer versus the benefits to us. There are various others, for example, contractual, which might be important if we need the data in order to fulfill the contract. But the key thing here is we do have some options. There's a parallel piece of legislation called the Privacy Directive. Now, this covers specifically cookies or anything that behaves like a cookie and anything that is deemed not to be strictly necessary. And all of the regulatory letters, guidance has made it very clear that regulators consider digital analytics not to be strictly necessary. And critically here, and in contrast to GDPR, consent is the only option. You must ask for upfront explicit consent. At the moment, these laws exist both in EU and the UK. There's been no divergence since Brexit. I'll come back to that because potentially there's a bit of change coming there. And finally, in the US, the US has probably been a bit later to the party in terms of legislation here, and there's no federal legislation around privacy that affects things like cookies. It's all state by state. California, probably the longest established. There's lots of states bringing on legislation that's quite similar to California. And ultimately, the premise is very similar to GDPR and e-privacy in terms of restricting how you share digital profile data, but a bit more of an emphasis on opt-out rather than opt-in. So the consent messaging is a bit different as a result. So that's the law, but the law is only part of the picture because we also have how the regulators understand the law and also even the law being open to challenge. So one of the things that was topical a few years ago was the idea that, for example, Google Analytics might be illegal in the EU, or that Facebook might be illegal in the EU. And this all came down to challenge to transfers of personal data between the EU and the US, mainly led by this guy, Max Schrems, who's a privacy advocate who likes to launch test legal cases in courts across Europe. So originally, there was an agreement that allowed EU personal data to be processed in the US under what was called the Safe Harbor Agreement. And this was challenged by the first Schrems challenge in 2015, which said that was in fact illegal because there was no way that the EU could stop the US security services essentially accessing that data without the knowledge or consent of EU citizens. So there was a new arrangement came in 2016, which was aimed to fix that legally. That was then challenged by Schrems again in 2020. And this time, critically, there was quite a big gap before there was a new framework agreed. So there was this period of about 18 months where technically it was illegal to send any personal data from the EU to the US without a lot of hassle. That was sorted in 2022. I think Schrems may be bringing us a Christmas present at some point in terms of more legal challenge to this. But it's a good example how the response of regulators is not necessarily uniform. So some regulators were quite relaxed, in fact, about businesses continuing to send data to the US when there was this sort of gap, and we're waiting for the courts to figure out what the revised law would be. Other regulators in some EU countries were very strict over that period. So a lot of this is quite contextual. In the UK, I mentioned that GDPR and e-privacy have remained the same in the UK and the EU post-Brexit. Earlier in this year, there was a new bill that almost made it through Parliament in the UK, called the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. Actually would have rewritten key aspects of GDPR and e-privacy in UK law. And it almost made it through, and then there was a surprise election. So it has stopped, it has stalled. It is slightly unclear what the new government will do with it. But interestingly, it did a couple of things that were quite new or old, depending on your perspective. So this is slightly boring legal text here. Basically, what this says is that under DPDI, it would be absolutely fine to set a cookie for analytics without any consent. So quite a big divergence on what's happening at the moment under e-privacy. So if something like this goes ahead, this means we could have some divergence between the UK and the EU. I think the Conservative government would probably be quite keen on that. Remains to see, perhaps the Labour government might be less keen on having that sort of divergence. But just one to keep an eye on if this pops up again coming through this next parliamentary term. So we have privacy regulators, but also the relationship between privacy and competition is quite important, and especially when we have large digital advertising networks and when we have large device manufacturers essentially controlling web browsers. So Google owning Chrome, Apple owning Safari. And a lot of this tension has been behind the kind of ongoing saga of whether Google is going to remove third-party cookies from Chrome. So for years, there was this threat that in 2021 and then 2022 and then 2023 that third-party cookies would be deprecated. And then there was a sudden U-turn over the summer. And it's interesting reading between the lines of Google's announcement on that U-turn, in that they very specifically mentioned all the regulators in the world, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, CMA, and the ICO. And that kind of really kind of hints at that tension between the fact that they're trying to provide something that protects users' privacy, but also you need to provide something that doesn't compromise the ability to have a level playing field for other advertisers and publishers that don't run a big platform like Google. So that tension has essentially resulted in a stalemate where Google, based on their dominance as an advertising business, is not able to remove third-party cookies because third-party cookies enable a lot of advertisers and publishers to effectively compete with Google. So I think this tension is going to continue. There's also been some tension recently around some interpretation around what consent means in a internet where a lot of the content is ad supported. So if you've been to a newspaper site in the UK recently, you've probably spotted a slight change in the consent messaging and this idea of you've either got to subscribe and pay, or if you want to read for free, you must consent to cookies. So is this legal? Well, it's clearly against the text of GDPR that says you shouldn't be forced to consent to something, and this kind of suggests here that you're being forced to consent to something. On the other hand, the ICO, the UK regulator, has been running a consultation on this, which started in March earlier in the year, where they suggested that actually they're quite interested in the views of how they maintain that balance between providing privacy for end users whilst allowing, in blunt terms, newspapers to continue to exist commercially. Bit conflicted potentially, a privacy regulator having to think about how newspapers are allowed to make money. But what seems to have happened is, again, changing government, the consultation never published its results. There was maybe some sense it might have fed into legislation and it didn't quite make it. And in the meantime, pretty much every newspaper has just gone ahead. So it's a good example of where the letter of the law might say one thing, but the attitude of the regulator and the fact they've kind of given this neutral stance and an indication they're not going to chase after people has meant that the industry's responded by actually implementing something. And meanwhile, the ICO seems instead to be getting very strict on people that don't use consent or pay, that are just doing a normal accept or reject cookies, to make sure that the prominence of those two accept and reject buttons are very equal. That's something they've been very much doubling down on in their letters to some of the biggest websites. Irrespective of what regulators think, what really drives both what our consented data looks like and also how customers feel is actually the perception of what's going on. And just because something's legally right doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that customers want. And there's definitely a much higher sense of understanding around consumers that their data is potentially being shared, and how their personal data is being used is becoming more important to them. If you excuse the bad data storing of this graph from Cisco, which inflates the relative change here a little bit, but definitely an increasing trend. In the meantime, there is the question of whether people can understand fully what they're being asked to consent to. So consumers want their information to be treated properly. They want to have a clear sense of how their information is being used, but then they're being asked very kind of technical questions about whether they consent to the usage of cookies for different purposes, and it takes quite a lot to unravel what that might actually mean, and a bit of an increasing divergence here. So I think that means when we're looking at this backdrop, it's important to understand that compliance isn't really straightforward and one-dimensional. So it's not a sense of, if we're not compliant at all, then there's 100% risk that we'll go to jail. And equally, we can just sort of turn up and be 100% compliant with the letter of the law, and we've eliminated all of the risk. I think it's more nuanced. And in fact, a lot of these things we need to look through the lens of understanding the impact from a few angles. So what the law says, actually what the regulatory attitude is, and that may vary in different jurisdictions and may be prone to change, as we've seen with things like consent to pay against the letter of the law. Current regulatory attitude in the UK, actually in jurisdictions like Germany, currently going through the EU Data Protection Board. Seems to be an openness potentially to that. And that maybe more moves into the arena of thinking about, well, what are customers going to think about this choice and what are the commercial implications of doing something or not doing something? So I think it's a good framework for starting to evaluate some of these questions and some of these implications as we continue to see change in these different areas. So that's the regulatory landscape. Next question is, how does this impact analytics? How does this impact measurement? Are we needing to build for some sort of cookieless future? We're seeing lots of vendors introduce new consent modes. What do those actually mean? And how does that work in the backdrop of having Apple behave in a completely different way to Google in how they construct the default settings in browsers and mobile apps? There's been a lot of great headlines around cookies. Apocalypse sounds quite dramatic, but there's probably a bit of lack of substance to some of these headlines in that they're very much focused on third-party cookies. And all of these headlines have all been targeting this idea that third-party cookies had an apocalypse in Apple years ago. Safari has been blocking them by default for some time. A lot of this has been focused on the idea that Chrome would join exactly the same policy and third-party cookies would disappear from the internet as a result. However, there's not been a lot of change around how first-party cookies are treated, and first-party cookies are typically more relevant when we come to think about our own digital measurement. So just to quickly summarize the details. So first-party cookies, they're first-party because they're set by the website that you're looking at. They only work, they can only be read by that same website. So they can't be read by another website or another website that embeds content onto your website. These are the cookies that are used for your own first-party digital analytics. So for example, GA or Adobe. They're also fundamental to how websites work, how checkouts work, how you sign into a website. And these might need consent. So we know we need consent to set first-party analytics cookies. That's not new. E-privacy has been around for over a decade. So they might need consent, but they're certainly not going away. There's no first-party cookie apocalypse. There never was. Not going to be one. Meanwhile, third-party cookies can be set and read across multiple websites. So they introduce this capability to target users. It can be highly intrusive and from a personal data processing perspective. They're used highly by advertising networks for things like targeting and retargeting, or for seeing that you did an action after seeing an ad. These are already blocked by a lot of web browsers, and they might eventually be blocked by all web browsers. With Chrome and Google are looking now, their latest strategy is to kind of allow you to opt in either to third-party cookies or to something else once they've got something else back past the regulators. So this could be a very, very slow death. But I think the key thing is more thinking about where they are already blocked. And in that context, thinking about the idea that, in fact, there is not one internet from a measurement perspective. We like to think when we look at digital analytics data, we are measuring one audience, that we're looking at attribution, that we are measuring one audience, but in fact, we're measuring different audiences with different rules of engagement, and it's not a level playing field, and it's not been for some time. So Apple, whether we think they are privacy first or Apple first, it's up to you, but Apple for some time have been blocking third-party cookies by default. Apple, via their intelligent tracking prevention, will actually curtail first-party cookies. So you might try and set a cookie for 7 days, and ITP says that cookie can only exist for a day in order to try and reduce the ability of brands like Meta to track behavior across different websites. ITP will remove identifiers that would identify one specific click from one specific individual. So to make it harder to track, for example, that somebody has responded to one specific email or one specific ad. And iOS apps are far stricter in terms of having a use it or lose it opt-in for sharing data with third parties. So that's one internet. The Google internet looks very different. So on Chrome, on an Android device, third-party cookies still accepted by default. No curtailment of first-party cookies. You can put whatever identifiers you want in the URL, and they're all going to be preserved. And then there's the third internet that we can't see, which is, again, driven very much by consumer response. So consumers that might say, well, I don't really trust anything to the left, and using browsers like Brave or using ad blockers that just block everything completely. No sense of consent or not consent, it's just stopped at the outset. So a few key changes driven by those trends. So because we can see third-party tracking is already highly curtailed by Apple, and we can see the trend in the market is generally towards regulators wanting to restrict the sharing of data and have more clear consent for it. There's naturally an increasing focus on gathering consented first-party data. Second thing that's changing is because there's always a gap for users that don't consent to measurement, increasingly platforms are using machine learning to try and plug the gaps in those consented data sets. And finally, because third-party cookies are less prevalent, there are new ways of sharing data. So those might be via privacy sandboxes, or they might be by trying to share customer data for customer matching. And some of these can be better for users' privacy, or some of these can actually be more intrusive, especially if they're not implemented correctly. So we'll look at a couple of examples of those. So firstly, consent modes. So I think Google has a consent mode, Microsoft has a consent mode for their tracking tags. What's the purpose of a consent mode? The idea here is to be transferring more context about what a user specifically consented to or not as data is transferred to a particular platform. And the main reason why this is important is that often we ask questions from a consent perspective of how do you want your data to be used, where there's actually one cookie that could support some or all of these things. So in this example here, I've consented to functional cookies, where here this includes analytics, and I've not consented to advertising cookies. However, there is one cookie that Google uses which fulfills both of those purposes. So the purpose of consent mode is that every time that cookie is transmitted, or the value of that cookie is transmitted anywhere, it is tagged with something to say, how can that data be used? So essentially providing additional context to take a cookie and say, the value in this has consent for these particular purposes. So this is a bit of a blend of ePrivacy and GDPR. So it's relating to consent to set the cookie, which is ePrivacy, but then also consent for a specific usage of that data, which is a bit more GDPR. And in the Google world, Google calls this passing of signals basic consent mode. So I put consent modes in quotes here because it sounds like a consent mode should mean that the user's giving more consent, and that's better for the user. Well, interestingly, another way that consent modes are being used is actually to transmit data when the user doesn't consent. So in this example here, I've not consented to the usage of cookies for analytics. I've not consented to the usage of cookies for advertising. And we might think that the outcome of that would be that, well, I'm not going to be measured. I'm not going to be sharing any data with anyone. But in fact, using what the platforms tend to be calling an advanced consent mode, sounds even better, doesn't it? What happens behind the scenes is that data is still being sent to these platforms just without a cookie. So this is a bit more gray area. It's technically compliant with e-privacy because we're not setting a cookie. However, under GDPR, we're still sharing personal data in the form of an IP address with these platforms, and it's a little bit unclear exactly what the platforms will be doing with that data. So get into a bit of a gray area around consent and legitimate interest if we're using advanced consent mode. Why do the platforms want to gather cookieless pings? Well, they want to capture cookieless pings to train some machine learning models. And the purpose of these machine learning models is to try and close the gap of what might have happened for users that did not consent and therefore cannot be directly observed. So this is a Google example where they're showing how they take unconsented and consented data, and they're able to directly measure how the consented clicks converted, and then they use some machine learning in order to model what they would have expected or what they predict would have happened to the clicks that they couldn't directly observe because the user didn't consent. And that gives us the ability to essentially report on a different conversion rate. And you notice the use of the word true in quotes. Is it true? Is it better? Well, it's attempting to fill a gap we know we can't observe. But we've got to watch out for who's regulating this model and how accurate is that prediction. Does Google have an interest in being particularly bullish in terms of the sensitivity of that model? One of the big changes in digital measurement to watch out for is just this blending of real observed data and modeled predictive data. Increasingly happening, very easy to switch on in Google Analytics, Google AdWords, things that are being used increasingly by all the advertising networks. Another approach that's being used in order to make attribution better or easier, depending on your perspective, is the more explicit sharing of customer first-party data. So I don't know if anybody else finds this image slightly creepy. It maybe does indicate something potentially creepy going on behind the scenes. So from Meta with their conversion API, they're making it very easy for you to share personal data with them in the form of hashed email addresses, first names, last names, hashed phone numbers, all sorts of things that would allow them to tie back a transaction on your website or mobile app with a specific Facebook user and everything that they do whilst logged into their platforms. So maybe a different way of articulating their slogan, the better your data, the better your ROI, would be the more data you share with us, the more we can report that our advertising generated your conversions. So what you're doing by sharing this data is giving Facebook that ability to join the dots across platforms, and therefore makes it more likely they'll be able to come back and say, yep, all those people that purchased had seen ads on our platform. Flip side, you are sharing very personal data. A hashed email address still tells Facebook that this person that they can identify as a name with all sorts of personal information did something on your website. So therefore, it's probably the most sensitive stuff you could be sharing. And you've got to be really careful not to do that without very clear consent. And Facebook make it very easy to do that just by flipping on a tag that will automatically scrape that data from a confirmation page, for example. It's something to be really careful about. One of Google's kind of solutions or ideas for dealing with not having third-party cookies was the idea of the privacy sandbox. So I think in the industry, we're going to be hearing a lot more about sandboxes and clean rooms. What's the difference? Sandboxes probably more likely to actually run on your device. Clean rooms more likely to run in the cloud. So Google's privacy sandbox mainly runs within the browser, and the idea is that it's able to do the personal data processing in the browser and then provide very limited access to non-personal aspects of that data to for example, advertisers. So it's a way of recreating some functionality around things like retargeting or targeting to particular interest groups without ever sharing with an advertising network who you are, a particular cookie ID. It's always based on some very restricted segments being shared. Does Apple have a sandbox or a clean room? Probably not really, but they have something that behaves a little bit like one in that they have the scan network, which is just about to be replaced by the ad attribution kit. It's basically a way of doing attribution within mobile apps across App Store downloads, mobile apps, and websites within the Apple world without being able to access user level data. So Apple's protecting the privacy of end users, but still giving you some data out the other end on how a particular campaign performed, for example. And then there's a lot of clean rooms. The idea of a clean room is basically that you upload some of your sensitive data. An advertiser also, or a publishing network also uploads some of their sensitive data, and then you have something that sits in the middle that makes sure that at no stage is anything being shared at a level that could identify an individual. So it's kind of a way of matching and enhancing data potentially. For example, with maybe a segment. So in Google's example, their ads data hub, that might enable you to upload some CRM data and use that to build a segment from an advertising perspective that just impacts your highest spending customers, but doing that without sharing the individual IDs of high spending customers, or you being able to see the behavior of those high spending customers in the Google environment. So there's a lot of algorithms that are built into this to prevent things being shared at a certain level of detail. It will cut up a lot of things if you get down to, for example, looking at a number of rows that would possibly enable you to identify an individual. I think advertisers and advertising networks will increasingly be shifting to this type of methodology as they're able to do less with third-party cookies. So a few practical recommendations. I think it's valuable to start actually for thinking about what your own browser device market share looks like between Apple and Google and others, because ultimately these internets behave differently. And if your mix is 50-50 versus 75-25, that could actually dramatically impact what both your measurement strategy is and also how you interpret the data. Prioritize your own first-party measurement and making sure it's as consented and complete as possible. So you're asking the right consent questions based on how you want to use that data. If you have the opportunity to have logged in users on your own platforms, definitely worthwhile enhancing that first-party data with logged in user IDs where you can, because that immediately helps you to make that more consistent and complete when people are moving between devices or first-party cookies, the time length of them is being curtailed. And just be really careful about accidentally sharing user identifiers that are actually very strong, like a hashed email. Very hard to clear out your email address with a third party like Meta without having some really clear consent for doing so. So that's the measurement backdrop. Clearly quite a bit of change there. So this final part is thinking about how does this drive how we approach the challenge of understanding what marketing works and doesn't work. How do we measure what's working? How do we understand what's driving impact? And therefore, how do we make good choices around budget allocation, around optimizing spend? And how do we do that at different levels of detail? So we're going to talk a bit about some existing methods that, I think all of these methods have actually been around for kind of over a decade, if not decades, but just thinking a bit about how the balance potentially shifts on how they work and where they might be more or less relevant as a result. So firstly, attribution. There's single touch attribution that helps us to link a sale or a conversion or lead capture back to one particular campaign. And there's multi-touch attribution that helps us to understand like a sequence of touch points that might have led to that end outcome. Attribution is under some pressure from some of these changes we've seen to digital measurement. And probably most of that pressure comes around how long-term it can be. So if we just take this customer journey here, this customer journey here is looking at a user that 30 days before sale is exposed to a paid social ad in Facebook. They don't click on it. And 7 days before sale, they click on that paid social ad through to the website, and then they return via a paid search click from Google on the day that they transact. So some pressures here. If third-party cookies are being blocked, so if we're in a Safari world, for example, then that means that our ability to link an impression to a later sale becomes curtailed. In fact, it becomes invisible unless we've got some other identifier to replug that gap. And that's why Meta and Facebook are so keen on us sharing hashed emails with them so they can use that to try and link it up again. If we've got a click that occurred a while before the transaction, then we have a risk that, particularly in Apple, intelligent tracking prevention may curtail that cookie and say, well, actually, that cookie is no longer going to last for 7 days. It's only going to last for 1 day. And as a result, we have a bit of a gap in our data. Once we get towards the bottom of the funnel, actually, attribution still works pretty well in terms of our first-party analytics. We can still measure the traffic source of clicks. We can still track them through to sale based on the first-party cookie. That first-party cookie is unlikely to be curtailed from a same-day perspective, but we do have to address consent. So we can only do that for consenting users, or we're going to have conversion modeling kicking in. We're going to have the machine learning from a platform like Google helping to plug that gap and potentially bringing a little bit more uncertainty into those metrics. So stepping back and thinking about the question of return on investment, how can these different techniques help? So attribution has always been best for near-term analysis. It's always been best for looking at things that have happened in the context of days rather than weeks of months. One of its benefits is it does operate across that full digital funnel, but it is very focused on digital measurement. And also it doesn't prove causality. So we might attribute that everybody that bought had seen our Facebook advertising, but that doesn't prove that Facebook advertising made people buy that wouldn't have bought anyway. So incrementality testing is a way of doing experiments, controlled tests, where we isolate whether people actually genuinely become more likely to buy based on being exposed to some advertising. So this is better for midterm in any case, and also it's quite focused on the action and purchase. So we need a very clear outcome we can measure from it that's quite immediate to measure. Longer term econometrics or marketing mix modeling could be really helpful when understanding what are the mix of investments across different channels, both online and offline, that help to drive an action, like action and purchase. In terms of plugging the gaps, if we're trying to understand longer term kind of awareness and longer term loyalty, and then generally brand studies, so brand trackers, surveys, things that may be tied to audiences that are and aren't exposed to marketing. So there can be an element of testing to here, can really help to plug those gaps. Incrementality testing is essentially a split test, a control test, where we isolate an audience who see our ad versus an audience that don't see our ad. And we look at how those audience that receive the treatment of the ad convert over the baseline. And most advertising networks will provide the ability to do incrementality testing. Traditionally, incrementality testing has been cookie-based. So it's random and it's based at a user level. Increasingly, in some contexts, the cookie-based approach is being curtailed, and instead those platforms may use something like restriction to particular geographies, for example, in order to achieve something similar. The terms MMM and econometrics are often used quite interchangeably. Generally, the difference, if there is a difference, is more around the scope of data that's being used for the model and what that impacts in terms of the types of decision you can make using the model. So actually MMM, potentially two different definitions. You can have just what's called media mix modeling. So media mix modeling, we're feeding the model just the output of sales and where we're investing our marketing. And that's generally used to understand what the right media mix is. So it's very much focused on kind of where do we invest at a channel level. Marketing mix modeling, the other MMM, takes that and adds in some of the other 5 Ps of marketing. So starts to think about promotions, starts to think about pricing, might look more at kind of what the different products are. And that helps us to drive a kind of more detailed kind of optimization of, okay, how do we mix, for example, channel, price, promotion? Which channels should we put our discounts in? Is it better to offer a discount versus just increasing our brand investment and not discounting at all? And finally, econometric can augment that by looking at some more external drivers. So, for example, what competitors are up to, what's happening in the economy, what's happening with consumer spending, and that allows us to drive some more sophisticated scenario planning based on what's going on in the market. So these 3 techniques, they're not new. And for a lot of businesses, using a mix of them has always been valuable. But I think there's a few things changing which potentially shifts the balance slightly. So the first thing is that attribution is always based on using identified user data, whereas MMM is always based on using trended, non-identifiable aggregate data. And incrementality testing could be based on either. As we start to see a shift for more curtailment of identified user data, particularly higher up the funnel, that starts to make things like MMM more important for understanding upper funnel measurement. And it might shift our incrementality approaching. But doesn't mean attribution is going away. Still good for near term. It's still good for detail of, for example, optimizing within particular campaigns. Incrementality testing, we might start to see some shifts from doing things at a user level to doing it more on a geographic level. And MMM is both getting more accessible. So, for example, Facebook and Google open sourcing MMM libraries that anybody can access, but also getting more sophisticated as we're wanting to try and overlay more sophisticated models that can deal with seasonality, that are able to get down to a more granular level. So simultaneously more accessible, but also there's some more sophistication there, more options that we can explore with MMM. So just wanted to finish with some just sort of practical tips. So I think if you're thinking about these themes, really good to start just with the context of what your own measurement universe is. So what's your kind of browser share? What's your focus on a mobile app versus a website where measurement works quite differently? Actually, what's your focus between online and offline in terms of both channels for customers to interact with you and also channels for promotion? And that might very much impact which of these techniques or which of these particular issues are more or less important to you in commercial terms. Now is a really good time to be making sure your first party measurement is as good as possible so that you're well prepared for the curtailment that's already happening to third party measurement. So that means making sure it's consented correctly, it's consented in terms of how you want to use the data, and it's as complete as possible, and you're enhancing it with your own first party data. So things like logged in user IDs. And then I think transparency is really important, irrespective of what regulators force you to do. Ethically, it's just very important that consumers have a very clear sense of how you're going to share that first-party data, irrespective of how you do it, whether you're doing it server-side, client-side, doesn't matter. And finally, worthwhile revisiting what's the right blend of attribution, incrementality testing, and MMM might be based on your marketing mix, based on your commercial priorities, and some of the things that are happening in the market around where you can measure at the top and the bottom of the funnel. Right, so I think we have some questions coming through. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So for the first question, it's a nice, easy one. We'll get access to the presentation deck. Yes, absolutely. We'll be sharing the presentation at the this afternoon. So you'll get a link to that. Okay, so I think first question, are the cookieless pings from Google's advanced consent mode legal under GDPR? So there are two lawful bases for processing personal data under GDPR. One of them is consent, and the other one is legitimate interest. So I think when people use advanced consent mode, typically what they're doing is they're asking the user a consent question when they arrive at the website, saying, are you happy for a cookie to be set? And the user is saying no. So they've clearly not consented to something. They've actively said no. So therefore, I think the only way you could potentially be sharing, essentially sharing personal data with Google, and it is still personal data because there's IP address and other things that could be used as identifiers in a machine learning model, is you're basically saying that there's some legitimate interest for doing it. So I think you've got to document that quite clearly in your privacy policy. And also you might look to use things like, for example, if you're using server-side tagging, you might want to obfuscate IP address, things that you're able to really curtail the level of any personal data that might be being shared as part of that. There's been no test law around it, so no regulator has gone and fined anybody or even warned anybody for using advanced consent mode yet. So I guess that's the other thing to do, is just to be watching out for any of those sort of trends. Okay. So next question. So how secure is server-side tagging compared to regular client-side? So server-side tagging is where, rather than having lots of JavaScript tags running in the browser and sending data to different platforms like Google, Microsoft, Meta, instead you send the data points that you might want to gather to a server, to something running in the cloud, and then that server-side container then streams that data through to the APIs of Facebook, Google, Meta. So an answer, how secure? In theory, it is far more secure. And the reason it's more secure is that you can control what data is being shared. If you have a client-side tag being deployed, that client-side tag can read any content on the page. So there's no way you can really stop it being badly behaved. So you might hope that a tag from a kind of respected platform is not going to read any data that it doesn't need, but actually there's nothing to stop it reading the name address, email address off your confirmation page and capturing that data. If you're doing server-side tagging, then you explicitly control what data flows to that third party, and there's no way they can see anything other than the data that you send. So that means in theory, it's far more secure and it's much better for the end user. However, the practice is really important. It also makes the transfer of that data to a third party invisible to the end user. They can't look at the browser and see what data is being sent out to different vendors. It's happening behind the scenes. So that means there's a really important duty of care, both technically and ethically, to make sure that you take consent and you use that to adjust what data you send out server side. So you still need to be respecting the consent choice. Okay, so question on the DPDI bills, this UK bill. And does that mean we'd have to have separate approaches to tracking for UK and EU visitors? Or would you decide to maintain the EU standard at the highest level? So I think there wasn't a lot of industry consultation on this bill, but what industry consultation there was essentially split between some people that are very pro divergence from GDPR and e-privacy from an EU perspective, in that it would allow them to do things that they can't do under e-privacy and GDPR in the UK. And that might, for example, consent or pay, being able to do analytics without consent, the idea that might result in less consent pop-ups, better quality of data. Other industry response was actually quite negative in terms of that divergence being very hard to maintain. I mean, even if you maintain a UK website designed for a UK audience, what happens if somebody comes to that website from the EU? You've still got that balance to strike. So I think my instinct is that it's more likely with the Labour government, it will be more aligned. If it does go through, there'll be more motivation to keep things aligned with the EU GDPR, and perhaps even some stronger regulation of things like AI as a result of it. But I think you probably would either have to go down a separate compliance route. So you'd have a different consent approach in the same way as you might have a different consent approach for the EU versus the US at the moment. Or you could measure if your opt-in rate is still pretty high, and also if you're needing to use those cookies, importantly, for other purposes such as advertising, then you would need to be getting consent for that anyway. DPDI only has that kind of additional get out for analytics, doesn't have it for advertising. So that might be a good reason to just kind of staying with the EU standard. Okay. So how does retargeting audiences change without third-party cookies? So I think there's two ways. Advertising networks are already trying to use more first-party data in order to achieve retargeting, and that's why they want you to share things like hashed emails, hashed phone numbers, those sorts of things, so that they know that a user's been on your website, and they're able to then use that hashed identifier to link that back to their first-party data, so that they can then start retargeting those users. So that's technically fine if the consent is there. Just need to watch out for that being done by stealth without users being aware of it, because I think that then just leads to we're back to square one and actually in a worse situation. The other way I think retargeting audiences will change is via sandboxes. So that's where there'll be the ability to, for example, share things via a sandbox in the Chrome browser. There'll be the ability to use an API that says, okay, I want to retarget users in a particular segment, for example, a segment that have looked at a particular product. And there'll be no kind of one-to-one matching of those user IDs being shared with the network, but more a sense of here's this segment matches this segment. So that will be less kind of accurate as a result, but will have curtailed a little bit the level of sensitive information being shared in order to enable that retargeting. Okay, so a couple of questions here, and these are not naive questions at all. So is advanced consent mode model data worth it? That's a really good question. So if we think about it just from a digital analytics perspective, so that's saying you were going to switch it on to get model data in GA4, how much it's worth it might be down to a couple of things. So the first thing is, what's your current consent rate? If your consent rate is already pretty high, then you're not going to gain very much from it. And actually, the way the model works is it needs to be trained on a good chunk of both consented and non-consented data to work. So ironically, been examples, if a website has a really high consent rate, then it never gets enough data of non-consenting users for the model to train, and therefore you can't enable it as a result. There is another option which I think is being alluded to in this question, which is a good straightforward option, which is to say, okay, if I know I'm measuring 80% of my audience based on my consent rate, I'm just going to take the numbers that I get and then I'm going to scale them from 80% to 100%. And that will give me a pretty good sense of I'm measuring my 80% sample and then I'm adjusting that based on the consent rate. Arguably, that's something you can control a bit more as well. You're not relying on a kind of third-party model. You're just able to do that some yourself. And then the second question here is anybody doing cookieless ads? And something more akin to old-fashioned broadcast and newsprint advertising. So I think there's definitely a shift to something in the middle, which would be, I think, what people used to call contextual, which is this sense of saying, well, here's the content I'm producing. This content is relevant to people that have interests in these particular areas. So therefore, I don't need to cookie the behaviors of people to show them something highly tailored here. What I need to do is just understand that if people visit this type of content, then they're likely to have these sorts of interests, and therefore this type of content equals this type of ad, and this type of content equals this type of ad for anybody that visits it. So it's contextual to the content rather than contextual to the user. I think the only measurement that's been done on that really was Google did their sort of privacy sandbox test at the start of the year, which was a bit based on using some of that topic-based advertising. And one of their conclusions was definitely, it's kind of I think it's in the blog post when they announced the U-turn. Or I can probably find a link for the follow-up. I think they found it was about 25% less effective than doing it at a user level, but equally probably haven't had a great deal of optimization as part of that. Okay, I think we've got one question. What time for one more question? How much historical data do you need for MMM? A good question. I think you definitely need good, accurate data around where you've spent your money. So for a lot of businesses, sometimes just getting that really good, accurate data for each channel. Ideally, you could want it as granular as possible as well. So if you've got it weekly rather than monthly rather than quarterly, that's always going to be better. And MMM models, they're looking for changes in trends, looking to identify correlations. So the longer you've got, the better. And in particular, if you're in a market with any kind of seasonality, ideally you want a couple of business cycles. So a couple of years is great if you're in travel, for example, unless you're in something that's got a much faster cycle. But the more data, the better. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and your engagement today. Just in terms of a few closing comments, there will be both a recording and a copy of the presentation, which will circulate this afternoon. There's a white paper that we're launching on this topic, so with a bit more detail on some of these themes, and that will be available for download next week. So keep an eye on our probably LinkedIn or X is probably the best way to just keep up to date. If you've got any specific questions from today or anything you'd like to chat to me or the team about, please feel free to drop us an email and we're very happy to continue the conversation. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.